Welcome to this series on Foundations of the Ageless Wisdom. I'm Dana Ivy. Anyone who has spent even a little time browsing through theosophical writings will see that there are wonderful treasures of wisdom to discover. And yet, with so much available, how is one to begin an intelligent study of theosophy? What should one read? And how does one interpret the sometimes obtuse statements made by early theosophical writers? How does any of this information apply to daily life? In this 5-part series, Ed Abdill attempts to establish a foundation for theosophical study. He will explore insights he has garnered in over 35 years as a member of the Theosophical Society. These 5 programs were recorded in front of a studio audience and are based on lectures Ed has been giving for many years, both in New York City, where he lives, and throughout the country. Much of his time will be spent introducing us to and exploring the 3 fundamental propositions given in Madame Blavatsky's proem to The Secret Doctrine. Such an approach is not without merit. Blavatsky herself, when speaking to students, said that reading The Secret Doctrine page by page, as one reads any other book, will only end in confusion. The first thing to do, she said, even if it takes years, is to get some grasp of the 3 fundamental principles given in the proem. Ed will be using these 3 propositions, as well as other theosophical ideas, to develop a framework for a theosophical worldview. What we hope emerges is a kind of theosophical lens through which one can explore life more fully. Throughout, Ed will be correlating this worldview with modern scientific theories. It is also hoped that you will take advantage of the study guide which accompanies this videotaped series. Exercises follow each program. By doing these, either as part of a study group or individually at home, you may greatly enrich your understanding of the concepts presented in the programs. In any event, have fun with these materials. They are intended solely as guideposts for your own individual explorations of the ageless wisdom. For now, however, let's go to Ed Abdill for part 1 of Foundations of the Ageless Wisdom.
In approaching this course, one might reasonably ask, how can an understanding of the most abstract principles have anything to do with or any use in our personal life? Isn't it really enough just to live a kind, productive, wholesome life? Isn't it really enough just to love? Isn't it really enough just to be good? Well, maybe it is. But what is the good? That really is not so easy to answer, perhaps. To do the good, it seems to me, we must know what the good is. Let's take a very simple example. Let's say that a very kind-hearted woman living in New York City loves plants very dearly. And she's given a flowering plant one day that is just beautiful. And she loves it very, very much indeed. And she wants to do good by that plant. And so she assumes that the plant should be watered every day faithfully. She loves it, she talks to it, she sings to it, everything she can think of, but faithfully waters it every day. And at the end of a week or 2, the plant is dead. Why? It was a cactus. She didn't know what the good was. Even if we want to do the good, you see, we must know what it is in order to do it. That seems obvious when we think about it, but we don't very often. In this course, what we'd like to do is to point the student toward what we might call the ultimate good. We're not going to spell it out, but we want to point the student in the direction of the ultimate good, that they might come to reach it, understand it in some way in their own experience and being. We're not talking about the sentimental good with which we're all familiar. We're not talking about the good that changes from person to person, from culture to culture, because it's defined differently, isn't it, by different cultures and by different people. One person thinks one thing is good and the other person thinks that's not good. We're trying to point the students toward an ultimate source of good, really in Plato's sense, not that sentimental sense, but in Plato's sense of the good, which means the eternal, that which never changes, that which is immutable, unspeakable, unthinkable, the ground and source of being. That's the good to which we want to turn our attention.
Madame H.P. Blavatsky, co-founder of the Theosophical Society, refers to this ultimate good in the first fundamental proposition as, quote, an omnipresent, eternal, boundless, and immutable principle on which all speculation is impossible, since it transcends the power of human conception and could only be dwarfed by any human expression or similitude. It is beyond the range and reach of thought. In the words of the Mandukya Upanishad, unthinkable and unspeakable, unquote. This omnipresent, eternal, and boundless principle, referred to by Madame Blavatsky, is said to be similar to the notion of the pre-Big Bang void of modern physics.
Both physics and theosophy suggest that everything has arisen out of complete emptiness, the stillness of the infinite, undifferentiated space. That being so, you see, then that void or that emptiness is not really empty, except in the sense that it is no thing, but it's actually the plenum as well. Because within that darkness of everlasting space lies the potential for everything that is, for everything that can ever be, and that includes you and it includes me. Now, if that is the ground of our being, if it's the source of everything, if it's that to which we want to turn our attention, the ultimate good, the real, the eternal, the one, why does H.P. Blavatsky say it's unspeakable and unthinkable? I think there's at least two reasons for that. First of all, it's the nature of our mind. Our mind understands or knows by contrast, isn't that so? We can know black because there's white. If we're in a train moving along, we know whether we're moving or not by the contrast, don't we? And sometimes we get confused and we think, oh, we're moving. And when we look more closely, we see that the other train is moving. So we know that we're moving by contrast. If we were absolutely alone in the universe, if that were possible, and you could still be quite peaceful and happy and content and alive, which of course is quite impossible, but let's imagine that it's possible, and there was no other thing, no stars, no sun, no nothing. How would you know whether you were moving or standing still? You couldn't, could you? There'd be no wind, no breeze, no movement. You're immobile. You see, our mind knows by contrast. Now, in that undifferentiated, eternal, boundless, infinite space before the universe comes into existence, there is nothing. No existence. Just eternal non-being, which yet somehow mysteriously is the only being. And so we can't think about it or speak about it because every word we use is a contrast, isn't it? The second reason, I think, that it's unspeakable and unthinkable is perhaps best seen by an analogy. Any eye, whether a human eye or an animal eye, any eye at all, I think I can safely say, will never see itself. It will see itself only by reflection. There may one day be instruments so magnificent that we can look into them and see every subatomic particle of our eye. Wouldn't it be fascinating to do that? But what we're seeing is not our eye, is it? It's the reflection of our eye, an exact image of the reality, but not the reality itself. This eye, therefore, will never see itself. And in that same way, you and I will never know the ultimate real because we are it, in that very same sense. Now, the great mystery is, why did this background void or ultimate reality spring into existent being? Why did that happen? When HPB was asked that question by a student, she said, "Don't ask me, ask Parabrahm." And Parabrahm is the Hindu name for that first fundamental proposition, the ultimate, unspeakable, vast reality that nothing can be said about. It's a kind of unanswerable question, why? Yet, from our limited human point of view, I think we can say perhaps this: it appears to be its nature to do so. And there is nothing in the universe that can violate its own nature. We are what we are. We can't be giraffes if we're humans. Now, while we can't say too much about the why, I think we can say something about the how. And the Secret Doctrine does make an effort to tell us some aspects of how this universe comes into being. How, from the undifferentiated, unmanifested one, does the many arise, including you and me?
The Secret Doctrine asserts that the universe comes into being by a process of polarization. Imagine that the screen in front of you represents the eternal, undifferentiated reality referred to earlier. Within this void, a fundamental polarity arises. On one hand, there is the subjective side of the universe, and on the other hand, its objective counterpart. We might think of the subjective side as unconditioned consciousness, or spirit, while the objective side can be called the root or the possibility of matter. From this polarization, a strange kind of tension is said to exist between the two poles that might best be described as abstract motion. So according to the Secret Doctrine, these three aspects, spirit, the root of matter, and abstract motion, are the bases for all existence.
And these three are one. In Hinduism, it's thought of as the great breath. So the non-existent one, which is that undifferentiated, unspeakable space, has now become the existent one, because now we can say something about it. You see, it has three aspects. It has subjective, objective, and motion. There's something to say and to consider with our human minds. But it is still one. It isn't stuff yet, in our sense of the word stuff. It isn't thingness yet. Now, those three realities, or aspects of reality, subjective, objective, and the tension between them or motion, do not arrive sequentially. I've had to do it that way, and we've done it that way on the diagram, haven't we? First showing one, then the other, and then the third term. They don't come into existence that way because they're an indivisible unity. They spring from the unmanifested one to the existent or manifested three in one at once, because they are not divisible. It's not dual, it's polar. Furthermore, that polarity does not take place as two dots, as we've shown on the screen, one here and one there. Rather, that polarity takes place at every point in the universe, at every point in that vast space. And when it happens, the entire space is brought into vibrant motion, so that the whole of it is revealing itself as these three aspects, subjective, objective, and now the reality of the whole thing from our point of view, motion, which is sometimes called life. There isn't any life without motion, is there? Interesting thing to consider. Now, a simple example might show how that can be. That is, how three aspects can be indivisible in one unity. If we take a bar magnet with which everyone is familiar, and we let the north pole of that magnet represent the subjective side or the subjective pole of reality, and we let the south pole represent the objective side of reality, and then we take the force field, which we see between the poles when we put iron filings, don't we, near the magnet. If we let that force field represent motion, then we will have an analogy of how the Secret Doctrine sees this unity in the triplicity. Now, let us say that we didn't know any better and we thought we'd like to have a north pole in one hand and a south pole in the other. We would break the magnet, wouldn't we? And we'd say, now I have a north pole and now I have a south pole. But you know it isn't possible, don't you? The minute you break it in half, you have another magnet here and one here. You have two magnets now, because you can't have the north pole without the south pole. So you see, there can be such a thing as a triplicity, which is yet a unity. All are present at every level of existence. It's a fundamental reality to which we don't usually put our minds. It's so fundamental that it escapes us. Everything is conscious, everything moves, everything is substantive. This is true, it's said in the Secret Doctrine, from the deepest level, from the most interior levels to the most exterior levels. So all three of those aspects are present in an archangel and in an ant. They're present in a galaxy and in a grain of sand. There cannot be, according to the Secret Doctrine, consciousness without substance and motion. There cannot be substance or matter without consciousness and motion, nor can there be motion without consciousness and substance. These three are one, and they're in everything. Now, this eternal reality then has become the existent. Non-existent space has become existent space with this polarization process. Now you might say, well, that's all very interesting theory, maybe kind of fascinating, but what, still I want to know, what does it have to do with me? What does it have to do with daily life? This idea of infinite space, which is the ground of being according to the Secret Doctrine. Rather than try to make a vain attempt to answer such a complex question, I would like you to do a little experiment, a very simple one which you can all do easily in your own minds. To begin with, let's consider the fact that this infinite space about which we've been talking is a far greater part of reality than the world with which we're familiar. I don't think we often think about that, do you? We don't stop to think that there's more space in the universe than there is substance. We don't stop to think that atomically our physical body is more space than substance. We really don't think about it. Oh, we know it because we've been told that by the science teacher in school. But it's a fact, isn't it, nonetheless, that we're more space than substance. And so in this exercise, what we're going to do is we're going to imagine, use our creative imagination and imagine that we're expanding into space. But more importantly, that we are the space. We identify with the stuff, you see, all the time, don't we? Let's identify for a change with the space, which is the greater part of us. Be the space. May I suggest that by identifying with space, the space of your body and the space of the universe, you have moved a little closer to the source of your own being. If you were able to do it even slightly, your mind became quieter, didn't it? Your emotions became more tranquil. And isn't that of enormous value to your personal life? By simply turning your whole attention to that most abstract principle, space, and identifying with it, you can bring that unspeakable peace that passes understanding into your own hearts here and now.
The following program is presented by the Theosophical Society in America.
In Part 1 of Foundations of the Ageless Wisdom, we started with the first fundamental proposition of the Secret Doctrine. It was spoken of mainly as space, as eternal, immutable, boundless space, upon which all speculation is impossible, and was likened to the pre-Big Bang theory of modern physics. We went on to suggest that this eternal void polarizes, which gives rise to a triplicity of spirit, the subjective side of the universe, the root or possibility of matter, the objective side of the universe, and abstract motion, the tension that exists between the first two. These three aspects are said to be the bases of all existence, and are present everywhere in the manifested universe. We are rooted in these three. They are the very essence of our being.
Now, to move a little further on, it is said that that triplicity further becomes a septenary. That is, the three becomes seven. Now, it isn't as though they become something else. It's as though that three expresses itself, in a sense, as seven major modes of being, if I can phrase it in that way. Seven planes of nature is what it's called in the literature. Now, just as that primary three is one, indivisible, whole, this septenary division is also really, ultimately indivisible. It's a septenary manifestation, but it's still unified. And it expresses itself in human beings as what we call the seven principles of the human being. And we'll discuss those more thoroughly as the course goes along. Now, in this class, we're going to look a little more closely at that third term of the primary three, motion. For some reason, to the human mind, that's in many ways much more fascinating to deal with, and I think you'll find some of it fun to think about. Before we do that, however, I think it would be nice to hear from HPB again in her own words as she summarizes the second fundamental proposition of the Secret Doctrine.
Madame Blavatsky writes, quote, "The second assertion is the absolute universality of that law of periodicity, of flux and reflux, ebb and flow, which physical science has observed and recorded in all departments of nature. An alternation such as that of day and night, life and death, sleeping and waking, is a fact so common, so perfectly universal and without exception, that it is easy to comprehend that in it we see one of the absolutely fundamental laws of the universe." Unquote.
Now, in the first fundamental proposition, space was primary, wasn't it? In the second, motion is actually primary. You didn't hear the word motion mentioned. You really hear more the idea of periodicity, of cyclicity, of the ebb and flow, the pulsation of the universe in the outward and inward movement. But you see, we can't have pulsation, we can't have periods, we can't have cycles if we don't have motion, can we? So motion is really more primary, and this idea of cyclicity is a way of describing that motion, how that motion reveals itself. Now, motion is referred to in quite a number of ways in the Secret Doctrine, and I'm only going to mention a few. It's sometimes talked about as divine mind. We might also think of it as life, and she certainly refers to it as the creative power of the universe. Now, I'd like to take just a minute or two to talk about divine mind, because I think there's an awful lot of simplistic thought out about divine mind. We tend to think, some of us, I think, that the divine mind is a thinking, feeling mind like our own, and that somehow the divine mind decided one day, well, I think I'd like to make an ape. And after making the ape, felt a little disappointed and said, well, I think I'd like to make a human being. And after doing that and having us around for a while, thought, well, I think I'll wipe them all out with a flood. Well, I don't think the divine mind is that way at all. When we talk about divine mind, we're really talking about fundamental principles in nature. So that if you, for example, should look in the corner of any room, you will see that 3 lines come together at the corner, each one at right angles to the other 2. Now, at the risk of heresy, Jesus, Gautama Buddha, or H.P. Blavatsky could not put a 4th line through that central point and have that 4th line be at right angles to the other 3. We couldn't do that. We can say that's an idea in the mind of God or in divine mind. It's an inviolate principle. It's the way things are in this 3-dimensional world. That's the nature of divine mind. It's the principles themselves. Now further, she says about this motion or divine mind, that it's the creative power of the universe. And that's very interesting, really, because very often in mythologies we find that the creative power is a secondary deity. In the Christian system, for example, it's not God the Father who actually is the creator, but God the Son, you see, who issues from the Father, who is not a creation according to the Christian theology, but it is He in John's Gospel who creates all that is. Without Him was not made anything that was made, I believe the words are. And that is an issue, in a sense, from the Father, and yet still one with the Father, as motion is one with the other 2 principles in the Theosophical idea. Now, we must have it clear about creation. We tend to think of a creator and a created. This is not the case in the Theosophical philosophy. And the Master K.H. in writing to Sinnett made this very, very clear. Sinnett was an Anglican Christian. He was living, of course, in the last century, not familiar with these ideas, and it was very difficult for him to understand the whole theosophical concept of creation. And the Master K.H. said to him finally, go on and think that man and nature were created, and you'll be running up against hard facts forever. But once realize that human beings and nature were no more created than this iceberg now before me, and the whole thing will become clear. Both human beings and nature are states for a given time, depending on their state of development, their level of development. So you see, the iceberg wasn't created by someone, it's a state within the sea. And if we get that idea clear, I think it will, this idea of the unity and the diversity will become clearer as well. The diversity is in the states of this ultimate one as it changes, as it grows, as it evolves. But what is that iceberg? It's part of the sea. It's the sea itself, isn't it?
We can see motion as the creative power of the universe in the common everyday activities of our lives. Take the chemical composition H2O, for example. We use it differently and call it different things, water, steam, or ice, depending on its rate of motion. At colder temperatures, its molecular movement is slow, while at hotter temperatures it moves much faster. And yet all three are ultimately the same thing, part of one unity, when viewed from a broader perspective. Here, motion can be seen as a creative power producing seemingly different things. Just the rate of motion makes the difference between water, steam, or ice.
Now, if motion as divine mind is really the creative power of the universe, then don't you think it would seem to follow that all motion at every level, inwardly and outwardly, at every level, everywhere, would in some way reveal this quality of the divine mind, that is, the qualities of purposefulness, orderliness, meaning in its very broadest sense, if we can think of motion as divine mind, or the principles in action in a sense. Let's see if there may be some truth to it. I'd like to just go over with you a few of the kingdoms of nature, the crystal, the plant, the animal, and the human, and just see if we find some evidence that might support this idea. We'll start with the most difficult, crystals. They don't seem to move at all, do they? Well, they don't in one sense, but in another they do, because their molecular structure is in constant motion, isn't it? And the pattern of motion of a quartz crystal is different from the pattern of motion of a crystal of table salt. That's how we know the difference between the two, in a sense. It grows, in a sense, doesn't it? It accretes, it grows larger. It fulfills its own destiny, but it always maintains its own intrinsic order. It's always going to be a quartz crystal, and it's always going to have its own internal order of motion. But then we come to the plant kingdom. Now we can visibly see movement. And we see that plants at least move in two major ways. They put their roots down to get water. They also put their roots down to stabilize the plant so that it doesn't get blown over in the wind. It seems to be purposeful, that movement down into the earth, doesn't it? And then the plant moves in the other direction. It moves up to get the light of the sun, to get food from the sun. Now, if we come to the animal kingdom, there is a tremendous variety of motion, isn't there? All kinds of movements of all kinds of creatures. And now they're much more free, aren't they? The rocks couldn't do much, the plants a little bit more, the animals have a great deal more freedom. And we can see different types of meaning in the motion, and sometimes we don't know what the motion is all about. I think the species know, but we don't. Now we come to the human kingdom, and the mind reels at the possibilities. Let's take something like body language. If we're talking to a friend, and as we're talking to the friend, we're having a nice conversation, very pleasant, and then we bring up a particular subject, and our friend folds the arms across the front, a motion. That usually means you've hit a bump, and you'd probably better back off at that minute until you can straighten it out and the arms relax. Not necessarily every folded arm means that, but that can mean that. If you see someone walking across the lawn or across the sidewalk, see them outside, walking along, and you've never seen them before even, if they're walking very, very slowly and they're drooping their head down, you would probably think, and you would probably be right, that either they're in a meditative mood, or they're very sad, or something of the kind. You would certainly not assume that they were jubilantly happy, would you? Because the way they walk reveals something about the way they feel.
When I was younger, she'd come to me in dreams.
Music is another obvious example of motion. Indeed, our whole experience of music is motion-based. Every sound we hear is a vibratory quality, for it is through vibration of the air that musical sounds are carried to and heard through the mechanisms of the inner ear. Different musical instruments produce different vibrations. If we add other vibratory factors, such as tempo, rhythm, harmony, and melody, we begin to see the many ways in which music as motion is a powerful force in our lives.
And no one could ever tell me, and I don't think anyone could ever tell you, that there isn't a vast difference in meaning between acid rock and Mozart. There's a tremendous difference of meaning. No matter which we like or whether we like both, no moral judgments, it means something different, doesn't it? Now, our whole nature really is in one sense a vibratory state at all the different levels. And motion all through, inwardly as well as outwardly, has meaning. All conscious motion, I think, has meaning. Even if I reach up to scratch my head, I've done it for a purpose, haven't I? We talk with our hands to emphasize something. We have the body motion, as I said. But also there's unconscious motion inwardly. The heart is beating for its purpose, carrying out its job. The liver, the kidneys, the blood, all moving in their own way for their own purposes for the sake of the body as a whole. Now let's look at our emotions. We've fairly well established, I hope, that motion may indeed have purpose and meaning and order in the different kingdoms of nature. But what about inwardly? Because motion is there also, we suggest. Certainly the Theosophical philosophy insists upon it. Let's just take two emotions with which we are all unfortunately familiar, and then some more pleasant ones. Anxiety and depression. We've all experienced those two at least a little bit in our lives, I hope not much. If we had to say that anxiety was either fast or slow, I think most of you would say it feels fast. And if we had to say that depression was either fast or slow, I think most of you would say it feels slow. Now let's take two other emotions. Let's take enthusiasm and serenity. And again, if I ask, how does serenity feel? You would most likely respond, slow. And how does enthusiasm feel? You would most likely respond, fast. So we can think of our emotional states in terms of motion as well. But note well, anxiety and enthusiasm are both fast, but we'd sure rather have enthusiasm than anxiety. Depression and serenity are both slow, but we'd rather have serenity than depression. So there's something else at work here, perhaps rhythm, perhaps all kinds of things. But it is nonetheless fascinating to see that inwardly, subjectively, we can see our emotions in terms of motion. Now the mind also can be thought of in terms of motion. We use expressions in our language like that individual is very slow to change their mind. That's when we're being kind. They may be stubborn. We say someone has a very quick mind. Terms that are referred to really from motion, aren't they? Quick, fast, movement. We say an idea flashes on our mind. Again, implicit in that is the idea of motion. We talk about the tidal wave of human thought. Again, phrases that suggest motion in the mind. Now, in coming to a close for this session, I'd like to go back for a moment to that first fundamental proposition, which must never really be forgotten. That idea of the intrinsic unity of all, that everything really is differentiated states of one indivisible reality. If that is so, then surely everything must affect everything else. Isn't that reasonable? Because all is one fabric in a sense. Therefore, a tug at one part of the fabric will affect some other part of the fabric. We can see this at least in our own personal nature. And indeed, there's a lot of evidence out in the scientific world that that's true now. But let's just stick to our own personal experience. Let's take first a negative example and then a positive. If I am worried about something, that's a mental state, isn't it? It's an idea that bothers me, a concept, something bothers me, a thought about something, a fear. That idea, projecting into the future, afraid of something that's going to happen, which I have conceptualized, will affect my feelings, won't it? It'll make me very anxious. And if I continue to do that in a pattern over and over again, not if I just do it for a few minutes or a day or two or a week maybe, but if I do that month after month, year after year, I can almost guarantee an ulcer or a heart attack or something of the kind will occur. The mind affects the feelings affect the body. And it can do it in a positive or a negative way, because a joyful person does it the other way around. Now let's take the happy one. Let's say we're sitting along, not too energetic, we are a little bored maybe with life at the minute, and we start to think about some project that we've been dealing with, and we suddenly get a creative idea. Wow, that's fascinating. Right away, our emotions are joyful, and we've got energy. We get up and feel like we want to do something. So an idea in our mind can affect us in both ways. Now I think I'd like to have us think for a minute again about this idea of the internal patterns of energy. Whether we're depressed, anxious, joyful, our inner state really can be thought of in terms of motion. And I think it helps a great deal if we do think of it that way. If when we feel in a way that we would rather not like to feel, if we remember that no one got in there with a mixmaster and did it for us. We did it all by ourselves. Now, do you see that there's great hope in this? Because if I have done it all by myself, I can also undo it all by myself. So we can now refer back to that idea in the Secret Doctrine that the universe and all therein is formed by accelerated motion set into activity by the ever-to-be unknown power. And what is that ever-to-be unknown power? It's that first fundamental proposition, that unspeakable reality in which you and I are also rooted. If that's true, you see, we have the possibility, I don't say it's easy, we have the possibility of retreating into that background state that we are, and from there, recreating the foreground within us, using that creative power of motion to actually change our lives.
The following program is presented by the Theosophical Society in America.
In our first two programs, Ed Abdill began establishing a framework for a theosophical worldview by looking at the implications of the first two fundamental propositions of the Secret Doctrine. In the first proposition, we began with the most abstract of all theosophical principles, the ultimate real, and saw how its three essential aspects of spirit, the root of matter, and abstract motion are the existent three in one, out of which the universe springs forth. We then said that this triplicity became a septenary, and that all of nature reveals itself in what the Theosophical literature describes as the 7 planes of nature. And yet throughout we see a fundamental unity, since all three aspects of the ultimate real pervade life in all its diversity. We demonstrated the existence of this unitive quality in nature by taking a closer look at the idea of motion as it is used in the second fundamental proposition. We saw that motion can make one thing appear to be many things, depending upon its rate of motion. By seeing this unitary principle in the obvious, one can begin to see it in the less obvious, as pervasive in all things and at all levels. In this program, we are going to look further at life's creative processes by continuing our exploration of the septenary principle mentioned earlier. How does it express itself in nature, especially in human nature? Of these 7, we are going to begin with the one considered most abstract, called by the Sanskrit term Atma. In simple terms, Atma is a point in the ultimate real.
Now, thanks a lot, you might say. That doesn't tell me anything. But first of all, let's look at the difference between a point and a dot. A dot represents a point. You'll see that in the diagram. No matter how thin I get that dot, no matter how tiny, even if only a molecule thick, it's still three-dimensional, isn't it? A point, you see, has no dimensions at all. It's just a locus, a location, a mathematical concept, which our minds can entertain. Please be careful to see this, even though we can never see a point. We have within us the ability to understand something so totally abstract as a point. So that point, it is said, is our ultimate eternal nature, and all else is transitory, although some aspects of us last millennia, perhaps, but not forever in the ultimate sense. Now that is said to be a point in this undifferentiated background, and the only way that we can come close to maybe all of us experiencing it, at least as its nature is to perhaps recall there have been times when we woke up in the morning and for ever so short a period of time, we just were awake. There was just that feeling of am. Isn't that true of all of us? For just a split second, am. Not where am I? Not what day, not what are my problems or what are my joys, nothing, just beingness. Everyone has had that, haven't they? Just that sense of beingness. That comes close to this idea of raw awareness or unconditioned consciousness. And it said we're a point in that unconditioned consciousness in a sense. Now, you see the objects of consciousness come before us very quickly. Oh, what day is it? Monday. Oh, I have to go to work and deal with that awful boss. Oh, it's Sunday. I have a day off I can sleep in. Oh, I'm going away this week. That's going to be fun. All those things come before us. These are the objects of consciousness that come before us. Now it's said we're one-pointed. Let me just recall to your minds other experiences that every one of you have had. You may be talking on the telephone to a friend, and your wife or husband or someone in the room starts to talk to you. And for a while you try to listen, and you try to carry on both conversations, don't you? And what do you finally do? You finally say, excuse me a minute, someone is talking to me. What is it you're saying? And then you come back, don't you? Why do you do that? Because conscious attention is one-pointed. We can do many things at a time. We can juggle, if we're good, and walk on a tightrope, maybe, and sing a song. That's doing a lot of things at once. But conscious attention is ever one disappointed.
The second human principle from the Theosophical philosophy is called buddhi, and comes from the Sanskrit root bud, which means to awaken. Together, both Atma and buddhi are considered universal principles.
Now, Blavatsky has some interesting things to say about buddhi. She calls it the vehicle of Atma, which doesn't tell us very much. She calls it universal mind. Now, that sounds strange. Doesn't sound so religious now. Then she says it's wisdom, and then a very strange one, it would appear on the surface, bliss. Why bliss? Doesn't seem to fit, does it, with the others? Cosmic ideation and spiritual intuition. Now, I like to use the word insight rather than intuition, simply because intuition to most people means a psychic hunch. That's very real. It's not unreal. We all have had something of that in our lives, probably, even if we've just known who was on the phone when the phone rang. But in the theosophical sense, intuition is getting an insight into something. It is struggling with a problem that we have. Maybe it's a mathematical problem when we're in the 3rd grade. And finally, after a little struggle and furrowing our brow, we finally say, oh, I've got it. That's an insight, isn't it? It's an understanding. It's when everything sort of comes together and we comprehend. What happens when you do that? Don't you feel happy? Every time you get an insight, when you really understand something, don't you go, oh, and a big smile comes. If it's a little insight, nothing too big, maybe it's not a great big smile, but it's a smile, and you feel rather energized usually. This is the nature of buddhi. Buddhi is not something that is just for so-called spiritual experiences. An atheist is also rooted in this. And every time an atheist gets an insight into a computer problem or into a mathematical problem or into any other situation before him or her, that is a flash from this level of buddhi. Now you see, buddhi is universal. The truth itself, wisdom itself, is there whether my mind gets it or not, isn't it? The earth was always round, even if people thought it was flat. It didn't suddenly turn round when somebody discovered it. It was always that way. But maybe when someone suddenly understood, you see, then that universal truth which was there all along flashed on their mind. So that's why Atma and buddhi are said to be spirit in the Theosophical philosophy. They are universal. It isn't my truth and your truth. It may be my understanding of truth and your understanding of truth, which may be different, but the truth is going to stay the same no matter whether I get it or I don't, whether I've perverted it or whether I haven't. It'll be there, like gravity, nonetheless, immutable, there all the time. Where it becomes galvanized into life is when it hits our mind, isn't it? Wow, now I've got it, you see. That brings us to the next theosophical principle called manas, mind. And it is that aspect of us which is our true individuality according to the Theosophical philosophy. And it is really obvious, if you think about it, from the examples that I've given, because the truth remains the same. We can accept that idea. Gravity is there whether I understand it or don't, whether I know about it or not. When I understand it, you see, it's individual. I may get an insight that you'll never get. You may get an insight that I'll never get. And it may be valid. It's the getting of it that makes it individual, you see. It's that aspect of us which can know, which is our individual self. And those three aspects, Atma, buddhi, and manas, are considered to be the reincarnating ego. That's what survives, not all the rest of us, not all the other parts. This triplicity within us, the beingness itself, the wisdom itself, or the truths themselves, the principles themselves of the universe, and our ability to reflect them or understand and get them. That knower, the one who knows, is that which survives throughout the ages. Now, manas is a tricky one. The principle of manas is actually dual in its appearance, though it is not ultimately dual. When our mind turns toward the abstract, toward the conceptual aspect, then it's called buddhi manas, because mind has actually turned toward insight, you see, or the level of insight, toward the truths themselves. All of us have the ability, every single human being, to entertain abstract concepts, as I said. Infinity, for example, which we'll never see. Everyone can sort of say, yes, I understand what it is. But even simpler than that, and easier to see, is our language. Every word we use is a concept. We can say chair. We can look at this chair or any other chair, wooden, metal, a bench type chair, all kinds of chairs. And we can say, yes, chair, and we know what a chair is, or table. Or we can see one color blue and another color blue, different shades of blue, and we can say, yes, I know what blue is. But no one has ever seen chairness. No one has ever seen blueness. Do you see? It's a concept. The animals don't share that with us. They can see the object. They can see this object, and a cat can understand within itself, with no words of course, that it can jump on this object. But in a million years, as far as we can tell from any evidence ever given by the animal itself, the cat doesn't say chair and table. You see? It just sees the object, the percept. We have the ability to conceptualize, and that is abstract. You see that? Chairness doesn't exist, does it? Any more than the point exists. It is, but it is abstract, and we are abstract in ourselves, and that's why we can do it, you see. Because we are that abstract nature ourselves. When our mind turns in that direction, we call it buddhi manas. Now our mind has an ability to do exactly the other way round. And this we share with the animals, with the cats and the dogs and all the other lovely creatures of nature. We can turn the mind outward toward the objects of sense. And when we do that, it is immediately enmeshed in the emotional nature, called Kamma, K-A-M-A, in the Theosophical philosophy. Not karma, K-A-M-A. It means craving, desire nature. Now, that has been thought of as something we must stamp out. It's true and it's not true. Because if we didn't have that part of our nature, we'd never do anything. It's partly the motivating force within us. And in one sense, the universe itself acts out of Kamma, the divine desire, you might say, to express itself. So we must understand something about Kamma before we say we have to stamp it out. It isn't really the principle we must stamp out. But when mind turns outward towards the objects of sense, it becomes identified with them. And it's right in between those two functions of buddhi manas and Kamma manas, right in between, that Blavatsky says the personal ego is formed. Now, we're going to say a lot more about that in the last class on self-transformation, but suffice it to say now that probably, now this is me, I've not read it in Blavatsky, but maybe it's there, but it's my understanding. It's very likely the reason that happens there is because the moment consciousness turns outward, there is a strong sense of I and not I. Isn't that true? The very fact that we look out gives us a strong sense of I or not I. Don't you think in meditation, perhaps one of the reasons most people close their eyes is because it shuts out that distraction of I and not I, and one can get a sense of the universal more easily without seeing the I and the not I, you see? So that gives us a strong sense of me, and then that so-called personal ego develops, having a function in the process, but in the long run having to be destroyed. Now, Kamma is the next principle, and Kamma connected with mind might be, I think Blavatsky calls it the animal soul. Now, if we want to talk about the spiritual soul, we're talking about buddhimanas, you see, that aspect of our mind which turns toward the Atma Buddhi. If we want to talk about the animal soul or the personality or the personal soul, then you're talking more about Kamma manas, that aspect of us that gets identified with the thinking, feeling nature. You can't really separate them, actually. Thinking and feeling go together, absolutely together. You can't have an isolated feeling without thought, even if it's subconscious thought. And you can't have an isolated thought without some feeling. So Kamma is the craving nature, and it's part of a universal order. It's not just part of human beings. Animals have craving, and even plants to a certain extent exhibit it by their, can we dare say, desire to get water or light. It isn't quite, I don't want to anthropomorphize plants, but there's something of that quality everywhere, and in human beings we have craving not only for physical things, we have craving even for beautiful art, beautiful music. It isn't bad, you see. It isn't good. It's part of our nature. It's when we become identified with it that all hell breaks loose, as it were. The next level we might call prana, vital energy, so that we can experience that as vitality in our being. And Blavatsky says it's not individual. I find that very interesting. It's as though she feels it's a sort of an energy that runs through us, like the air comes in and goes out, you see? And it is that prana that's used in healing very often. People, when we bump our knee or something, or hurt our arm, isn't it a universal reaction that we touch it? We put our hand on it. I've often thought maybe we understand subconsciously that there's a kind of an energy always flowing through the hand, and somehow it helps a little bit, doesn't it? So that's prana. Now that expresses itself through what's called the a Sanskrit mouthful, Linga Sharira, spelled Linga Sarira or Sharira. It's a transliteration, of course, from Sanskrit. And the later literature had I think, an improved term here. They called it the etheric body. But in any case, whatever we call it, this is in the nature of a force field. You know, if you take iron filings and put them on a piece of paper and put a magnet under it, they all line up, don't they, along the lines of force. We all know that. The Linga Sharira, or the etheric body, or the etheric double as it's sometimes called, or in Blavatsky's terminology occasionally called the astral body, later literature used Kamma for astral. The force field in this case is dynamic, it's moving, it's changing all the time. It is that which is there first in the womb, and it is around that that the physical atoms and cells and organs, you can almost say, accrete. You see, like the iron filings? That's what holds them together, that etheric field. But it's a dynamic one. You see, it's growing and changing. So in a sense, physically, at least, and I think otherwise as well, we are our karma. It isn't we get it from outside. We are it, you see, because that field is the production of the past, in a sense. It comes out of the actions and the forces and the powers of our own past, created unconsciously by us, because God knows if we did it consciously, we'd have done it differently. But it's created by us nonetheless, according to this philosophy. And then, of course, finally, we have the physical body, which needs no explanation from us in terms of knowing we have it and dealing with it every day. But nonetheless, it is critically important, I feel, that we understand that this physical body is the vehicle for all of the principles. Every single one of them is revealed here in this body. So we must never denigrate the physical world. This universe went into an enormous amount of trouble, if we can put it that way, to create this visible universe. How dare we say it doesn't matter, that we want to be spiritual and pay no attention to the physical? This is nonsense from a theosophical point of view. This is the end product. Well, not end because there's no end, but it's the outermost revelation of this whole process. It's that toward which the universe has been moving all this time, to reveal all those principles in the exterior world, you see. And so St. Paul said very wisely, the body is the temple of the living God. It's very interesting to me that. And I think we must always remember, and Gautama Buddha pointed out that enlightenment can occur only while we are incarnate in this physical world. Why? Well, I daren't guess what Gautama would have said, and so I won't. But I suspect he might have meant that we can't be enlightened unless all 7 principles are active together, you see. Then we understand how the whole thing fits together. That's enlightenment. Really comprehend it in ourselves, not just believe it. And that is perhaps the reason why in this physical body only enlightenment can occur, because after death, of course, the body is gone, the prana is gone, and the Linga Sharira soon goes. But the process of dying and the process of in-between incarnations is a rather lengthy one, and I only want to allude to it now, to say only that after the death of the physical body, the prana has gone, the physical body begins to disintegrate, and the Linga Sharira, or the model body, also disintegrates, at once with cremation and more gradually if the body is buried. Those principles go rather quickly, but we're still ourselves inwardly. And that's how we identify mostly anyway, isn't it? With our feelings and thinking and all that. We think of our body when it's hungry or when it hurts or whatever. Otherwise, we don't so much, do we? We live in our feelings, don't we, most of the time. And there we are still living in that world called Kamma Loka, the world of desire. And we progress gradually through various stages until finally the essence of our being is all that's left. That beingness, that real self, the wisdom behind it, and the ability to know it, to be it, remains. And then, after a very long, incalculable period in some cases, the incompleteness of it asserts the necessity, in a way, to push forward for a new experience, and the process of reincarnation begins.